Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dave Deptula, Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, and welcome to Aerospace Nation. Today, the United States faces an unprecedented set of national security challenges. Whether considering China's rapid military modernization, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or the continued threat posed by Iran and North Korea, the world's an incredibly dangerous place. And our homeland is under threat in ways that we've never seen before. Now, while each threat element may differ, a constant is the increasing demand by the combatant commands for air power and space power. Secretary of the Air Force Frank Kendall has been leading the department with a series of modernization efforts throughout his tenure. Optimization of the Department of the Air Force organizations, operating concepts, force design, and acquisition. His vision and leadership have had a huge impact. So, Mr. Secretary, thanks very much for taking the time, the end of your tenure, to be here today. We know that you have a bit of a cold and a sore throat. I was going to offer you the opportunity to make a couple of opening remarks, but I'll leave that up to you for how long you want to do that.
I'll take a minute, Dave. Thank you. It's good to be with you and be back at the Mitchell Institute. I do have a little bit of a problem with my voice here, and I'm going to do the best I can. I apologize in advance for that. As I sit here and contemplate, the last 3.5 years of my tenure, overall, I'm pretty happy with the progress we've made in a number of areas. I'm always impatient. I'm always trying to go faster, and I wish we could have done some things earlier and moved a little more quickly. But overall, I came in with a big focus on modernization. I knew from my time as Undersecretary for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, and my work, while I was out of government, that we had some work to do on that front. What I didn't appreciate initially was how much we also had to do to reposture the Department of the Air Force to deal with a peer competitor. I was a Cold Warrior for 20 years, and I know what it's like to have a peer competitor and to be motivated by and driven by that. And over 30 years of presumed U.S. military dominance, and short budgets in many cases, and continuing deployments to the Middle East, we had a little bit gotten out of the habit, if you will, of orienting ourselves on our pacing challenge. So we had to do a number of things organizationally and from a readiness and training and other aspects to create what I call a competitive ecosystem in the department that was designed around being competitive against the kind of threats we have now: China. We've made good progress on that, but I would like to have started that earlier. We've made reasonable progress on getting the funding we need, but more is needed. I'll be blunt about that. The bill that limited us in 25 had some pretty significant impact on us. Again, it's about moving faster. We, in general, have, through the operational imperatives and follow-on work, identified the things we need to do to be competitive. Now we just need to get on with them as quickly as possible. That journey doesn't end. The threat keeps changing, and just over the last 3.5 years, it's gotten much worse. And we have to continuously respond to that. And one of the things we tried to create with Optimizing for Great Power Competition was a set of institutions that are designed to do that and to do it as efficiently as possible. Overall, again, pretty pleased with where we've gotten. Wish I could continue the work, but I feel like I've left the department in pretty good posture.
Well, very good. Ben, thanks very much for that. Sure, let's dig a little bit further into a couple of questions before we open it up to the audience. The Air Force has long been known for its core missions of air superiority, precision attack, ISR, global mobility, and command and control. And while it's clear the Air Force is committed to sustaining these functions, could you comment on how your efforts are aimed to best achieve them given the set of threats that we're facing today?
I don't think about it exactly that way. I think I try to take a broader contextual approach. And the first question I ask is, what wars do you want us to be able to win? What are the stressing scenarios that should drive the set of assets and units and capabilities that the Air and Space Force have? So obviously, mobility is a core function that we're going to have to continue to provide for a number of ourselves as well as other services and the Joint and Combined Force. Precision strike is something that we have to provide both from a strategic deterrent perspective as well as from a conventional perspective. And the mix of ways we do that, shorter range and standoff capabilities is one of the questions on the table. ISR, there's a question there, do we shift more capability into space? And deal with the potential vulnerabilities you might have in space. There are reasons to do that. Air superiority together with strike capability, precision strike, is part of the suite of things that we do to resist aggression. And we're worried about aggression such as the Russians in Ukraine. We're worried about aggression possibly the Taiwan scenario. These are pretty stressing scenarios, right? So I think about it in the context of what operationally are we going to be asked to do, and what's the best way to achieve those goals. So clearly air superiority, ISR, mobility, I would add strategic deterrence to the list, are all things that we're going to have to continue to provide. But how much of it and in what way is going to depend upon where, when, and against what threats we have to do that.
Yeah, a very effects-based approach, essentially. Now, there have been a bunch of questions recently about the next generation air dominance, penetrating counter-air element that have stirred up some concern, and recently you came out with some announcements. Could you tell us a little bit more about what your concept for the future of NGAD is?
Well, let me take it again in a broader context.
Sure.
What drove us to take a look at some of the systems we had planned for modernization, including NGAD, was budget constraints. That's where we started, was an affordability concern. The NGAD platform, as it's currently intended, will be an F-22 replacement. It's a very expensive airplane that we could only afford in small quantities. And it has a relatively narrow mission profile designed around certain types of operations and threats. But cost started us down the path of saying, okay, is this really the right thing to do? Can we afford it? And if we are going to put money into a next generation tactical aircraft like that, is this the right one? So we've taken a hard look at that. We generally finished the analysis on that. Another thing that's changed since NGAD was conceived is the introduction of CCAs, uncrewed collaborative combat aircraft. So how this platform would operate in a mix that included uncrewed platforms as well. And then finally, issues with agile combat employment related to survivability and the basic concepts that we use. We also had to take a hard look at other functions like tanking and what we do for the future of CCAs after the first increment. So we felt it was very prudent, independent almost of budget considerations, to take a hard look at that mix and try to come up with a very sound decision about what we would pursue. Now, the election happened in the middle of the analysis we were doing. I don't want to make a decision that's going to be disrupted and reversed potentially by the new team. And whatever we decide to do about that mix of programs, the new team's going to want to be able to support it and take it forward for the next 4 years. So I felt it was really smart in this case to delay a decision. The analysis is mostly done, but the new team may want some additional analysis when they show up. But I want them to own this decision. And I don't want us to start industry down a specific course and then have to abruptly reverse that a few months from now. So it was, I think, the right thing to do to kick the final decision on this into the next administration. They're going to need to move fast. The 25 budget is already on the Hill. It probably won't be passed for a few more months. And the 26 budget's going to need to be submitted. So those are going to be the drivers on getting final decisions on what mix of capabilities is pursued. A big factor in there is going to be defense budgets. How much money is the new administration going to allocate to DoD, and how much of that is going to get allocated to the Air Force and Space Force? Those are unknowns right now. So we're trying to position the next administration to be able to address all those questions, make a sound decision, and then move it forward consistent with the constraints they have.
Really appreciate those insights. Now, switching gears to the space domain. Space Force was established in part to merge some of the space functions from multiple agencies and services into one service to consolidate fractionization, if you will, among dozens of entities. However, today, except for Space Development Agency, the same separate space organizations exist. Any thoughts from your perspective on where DoD needs to proceed with this?
It's a great question. I had my first conversation with the transition team yesterday. This is one of the things that was on the list to talk about. And I'm not going to go into the details of what we said.
Sure.
But My view is that we partially succeeded, I think, in that objective of consolidating. The Space Force was formed largely from the Air Force. It's a very small service. It's only about 10,000 active duty people. But we brought in elements of the other services to create the Space Force, but it's predominantly been Air Force. We brought in the Space Development Agency, which was in OSD, Secretary of Defense's office, and put that into the Department of the Air Force as part of the acquisition organizations within the Space Force. Those things have all gone fine. What we have not done is any consolidation that would involve the intelligence community, which is a major player in space as well. I'm not suggesting that should be done. We have a really good relationship with NRO in particular, and I think we can continue to work together closely and be successful. The Space Force is about to have its fifth birthday, be 5 years old, and I think we've accomplished an awful lot. I give Jay Raymond and General Saltzman both a lot of credit for what's been done. They've established, I think, a sound culture. They've done a lot of things to establish the institutions you need for Space Force. What they can't get around, there's nothing you can do about this, is their small size. And that's a fundamental limitation. And it doesn't make sense to throw a ton of manpower into the Space Force just to make it bigger. Those people need to have things, meaningful missions. But a very important part of what the Space Force does is provide services to the rest of the Joint Force and to our partners. So we need a mechanism by which that can happen and can happen effectively. I've used the phrase "one team, one fight" throughout my tenure. One of my acquisition leaders uses the term extreme teaming. The Space Force needs to do extreme teaming with a number of stakeholders. And that's a two-sided thing. And what I think we actually need in the Department of Defense is more people in the other services who are space trained and space aware so they can advocate for and understand the capabilities the Space Force brings and help integrate those capabilities into the other services. And that's an initiative that's come up recently. We really haven't had a chance to talk to my counterparts about it even, but I think going forward, that's something that really should be done. And in the Air Force, I have had some influence. What I've tried to do there is create more space awareness. Increasingly, we're moving capabilities into space. We're going to be moving communications capabilities into space. We're moving sensing and targeting capabilities into space. We're moving missile warning has always been there, right? PNT has always been there. The Joint Force is going to be very dependent upon space. And I think, quite frankly, the Space Force and the space capabilities are going to be decisive capabilities in a future conflict, particularly with a peer competitor. So we've got to make those relationships really strong. And it's going to be through partnering and extreme teaming and as much awareness and expertise in our sister organizations as possible so that works well.
Very good. No, thanks very much. I want to switch gears a little bit to one of your favorite topics, and one that is bubbling up in the news here most recently, and that's the cost of continuing resolutions.
Yes.
CRs caused by Congress are a huge cause of why programs fall behind budget and schedule. So, opportunity for you to pass your message to new members of Congress about why passing an on-time defense budget may be the most important part of their job.
Dave, I think we're coming up on 15 years of CRs, right? And last night it looked like this one was in doubt and we might have a shutdown now. All of these things are devastating. We've put out to the Congress a long list of the direct impacts of CRs. We've gotten used to, and we plan around the assumption that we'll have a short CR in the fall every year. But as we did last year, going 6 months is incredibly debilitating. It's inefficient. It delays us in getting things done. It does not allow us to ramp up programs we need to ramp up. It does not allow us to increase production. We're essentially giving away our most precious asset, which is time. So I can't say enough about how the negative effect of CRs. The people on our committees understand this. They know that this is devastating and debilitating, but the Defense Department, and it's on both sides of the aisle, but the Defense Department gets caught up in this broader national politics of the budget and ends up, paying a big price in terms of national security because of this dysfunction, basically, in our politics.
Yeah.
There's nothing good you can say about CRs.
Well, let's move Back to multi-domain approaches to accomplishing the missions of the Department of the Air Force. You mentioned it already that several of the missions normally performed or traditionally performed in the air moving to space. GMTI and some ISR missions are on the top of this list. Air domain threats are often cited as a compelling reason for this move. But given that space is now a contested domain, how do we ensure that we're not creating a singular point of vulnerability by putting all our eggs in the space basket?
It's a good point, and we don't want to do that. We're not going to walk away entirely from airborne ISR or other means of communication. You always want to present an adversary with more than one problem to solve. If you give them one problem to solve, all their efforts will go into that. You want redundancy for a number of reasons. So, the threats have driven us to, and technology too, frankly, the opportunities in space. But those have driven us to shift into space, but it's not 100%. We're continuing with the E7, for example, and that's going to be a very valuable platform. And the pacing challenge isn't the only challenge. There are a lot of other environments in which capabilities that might be vulnerable in a China scenario will still be very valuable to us. So it's going to be a mix, I think, for the foreseeable future. But the shift is definitely there from what we traditionally relied upon to more reliance on space.
Now, keeping on the space focus for a little bit, here at Mitchell, we applaud your efforts and comments regarding the need for space budget growth. But we're asking Guardians to do more than ever that they've done before, yet the current FY25 budget would slash around $1 billion from the Space Force. What's Congress missing when it comes to the budget trade-offs that need to be made to ensure that the Space Force can meet the demands of our nation's security?
What's been happening there is a combination of things that led to that. I don't know that it's really indicative of where we are. I think there's almost a consensus within DoD that we're going to need to ramp up funding for space. As I mentioned earlier, that teaming thing, our sister services know they need more capability in space for a variety of reasons. They're dependent upon it. So we get a lot of support internally. We have some legacy systems that basically we don't want to continue replacing. We want to get to more resiliency in particular. We also need to get to counter space capabilities that we simply basically don't have enough of right now by a wide margin. So those are things that need to ramp up as you go through a normal development schedule with lower funding at the beginning and then funding raising as you go further out. So there's some artifacts that are artificial that are unique to the current circumstances that led to that cut. What the Hill has done, as they've looked at 25, is they to fund their priorities, they have taken a lot of cuts out of the R&D accounts. Space Force is 65% roughly R&D. So, and the Air Force is about 25%. So when they've gone and taken a few percent out of every R&D program, the Space Force is, it suffers more from that. The new administration will have to take another look at this. We're leaving behind a draft budget for them to start with, which I think is in pretty good shape. And then they'll have to figure out again, how much are they going to put into defense and how are they going to allocate it. There's no question in my mind that one of their highest priorities should be increasing Space Force funding and accelerating the fielding of some of those capabilities.
Very good. One of the other areas of...
Can I make one more point about that?
Absolutely.
The Air Force can't pay for the Space Force. So within the Department of the Air Force, I can't solve the Space Force problem by moving, tens of millions of dollars over into the Space Force. The rest of the Joint Force and DoD as a whole, I think, and people appreciate that and understand it. I have made some moves there on the margins, but not dramatic ones. I think that needs to be considered in the context of the overall DoD budget.
Amen.
Yeah, I knew you wouldn't disagree with that.
Yeah, no, particularly having seen, if you really look at the true budget that the Air Force gets, the Air Force has been funded less than the Army and the Navy for 30 years in a row, and that needs to change. But
I'll make some comments on that after I'm out of office.
Okay. Let's go back to one of your signature elements that you've worked hard on and people have really grasped the hold of, and that's collaborative combat aircraft. At the AFA conference this September, we saw two Increment 1 versions, one by General Atomics and the other by Anduril. What's your vision for the whole notion, these components of the CCA force?
Well, first of all, I started this down this road. I made a decision 3 years ago. We were going to commit to fielding operational CCAs in significant quantities to work together with crewed fighters. The technologies that I had seen mature over my previous role in AT&L, as well as when I was out of government, convinced me we're ready to take that step. So to me, it's a one-way door. We're going to go do this. The analysis we had showed that using them in conjunction with crewed fighters for defensive counter-air pays off very highly. And I think more recent analysis says that for offensive counter-air it does as well. Strike is right behind that. So they're going to be part of the force, but we have to learn how to integrate them in the force. So the program we put together does several things at once. It starts the contracts for the 2 companies you mentioned to move to production within a couple of years, get meaningful inventory into the force as quickly as possible, a couple hundred airplanes, hopefully by the end of the fit-up. And also to develop the technologies for autonomy to mature that. You know, the ride I took in an F-16 was part of that process. And then there's the part about figuring out how to structure organizations and how to integrate them into organizations, what kind of basing you have, set up the maintenance concepts, things like that. So we have an effort to do all of those things right now. And we're going to learn from that. Now, this first increment was intended to move fast and give us a chance to experiment and learn from it. At the end of the day, our operators are going to figure out how they want to integrate CCAs into the force. The threat is moving in this direction too, and it's a very close race right now. So we got to figure this out. We got to get it right. I'm not ready to say that we're going to abandon crewed aircraft anytime soon. One of the functions that the crewed aircraft provides is highly secure communications to CCAs from their proximity, and a human battle manager who can employ them as effectively as a unit, if you will, a formation, as possible. I think that's going to be a skill that, and I've seen pilots doing this now. I've been to some of our primes where they have pilots and simulators managing significant numbers of CCAs while they're managing their own aircraft at the same time. So we're learning how to do this. So it's going to mature. It's going to evolve. My vision, if you will, is that our operators are going to embrace this, and they're going to move it forward, and they're going to deploy it in a cost-effective way. I was a little unsure as to how our operators would react to this, but when I asked them the question, how do you feel about this? They say, sir, these are going to keep us alive. Without these, we can't do the things we need to do to be successful operationally, and they're going to save a lot of pilots' lives. So I think that we're over that hurdle. And the question now is, how do we fit? And the nation has some incredibly bright young men and women who are out trying to figure all this out right now, who are much better at it than I am. And they're gonna figure it out. They're gonna solve that problem, and then we're gonna move forward.
Outstanding. I mean, I don't know anyone who would argue with that approach. I think some of the concern that currently exists is not necessarily with anything that you said, but I'll just be straightforward about it. You got someone like Elon Musk who comes in with the supposition that these things have a set of capabilities that we just have not gotten to yet. So there needs to be this, as you just described, pragmatic approach to it's not a matter of either or. Right now, it's a matter of both.
The key decision, I think, is the one I made to field CCAs, to work with fighters. I have a lot of respect for Elon Musk as an engineer. He's not a warfighter. And he needs to learn a little bit more about the business, I think, before he makes such grand announcements as he did.
Yeah,
it's provocative, it's interesting.
Right.
I can imagine at some point, I don't think it's centuries, by the way, I think it's more like decades, when something like he imagines can occur. But we're not there, and
Right.
It's going to be a little while before we get there.
Yeah, and like you said, aviators are enthusiastic about embracing this. It's all about accomplishing the end game goals in the most cost-effective as well as militarily effective degree possible. Staying on the same topic for a second, a little bit of a follow-on. How do you think about the follow-on increments, and how will those differ from this first tranche that we're seeing?
The trade-off is cost and capability, as it always is. One of the main virtues of the CCAs is they're relatively inexpensive. We want to keep the cost down, but we want to add capability. So how do you do that? One way is with a mix of capabilities so that every aircraft doesn't have all the capabilities you'd like to have. A fighter is designed to do a lot of things, a crewed fighter, have a lot of subsystems on it. Sensing, electronic warfare, command and control to some degree, a lot of communications, as well as carry a variety of weapons, right? Every CCA doesn't have to have all those things, but you have to have a mix that, working together again with a crewed aircraft, gives you the set of capabilities that's most cost effective. So that's where we need to go. Studies are underway to figure that out. We don't have final answers yet, but that'll be the next step. And then we'll get out with industry very shortly, assuming things stay on track, and start getting industry engaged and coming in with their ideas about how to do a cost-effective mix. So that in general is where I think we're going to head. I don't regard CCAs as expendable. They're not munitions. They're not. We don't intend them all to die. So there need to be enough survivability in them. The combination of how you equip them, how you design them, plus tactics, so that you can have a reasonable level of attrition in most scenarios. But they are things that you are willing to let a few of die in order to gain an advantage. So all that work has to be done to sort out what the best mix is, and that's underway.
Copy. Thanks for that. Look, no one knows better than you that the Air Force needs to recapitalize both its conventional and nuclear force structures. Decades of deferred modernization have yielded a constant decline in these Air Force force structures with no end in sight. Could you talk about the importance of adequately addressing both the nuclear and conventional
they're
areas?
both critical. It's not really. We need to do what's necessary to have strategic deterrence. Everybody who's ever looked at it says the triad is the right approach. I agree with that. We have two legs, of course, the bomber and the ICBM, and those programs are Sentinel's going through the non-McCurdy recovery process, I guess. B-21 so far is doing pretty well. That's a given. If there's a list of priorities, that's first. We have to have a secure, reliable, and effective nuclear deterrent. We also have to have effective conventional force against our most pacing challenges. So we have to do both. There have been some moves to try to set up a separate fund to do the nuclear enterprise. I'm neutral on that. You could do that. It doesn't change the bill. It just puts it in a different bucket. It makes the optics a little bit different. But there are only two ways to do all the things we need to do. You add money to the DoD budget and you give it to the relevant services, or you take it away from somebody else within the DoD budget. Those are the only choices. And we're going to have to figure out which one of those to do. We will not be successful in the future. Well, first of all, it's a given to me that we're going to do the nuclear deterrent. That's not optional. There are choices to be made about investments in conventional capability. But if we don't adequately fund the Space Force and the Air Force, it's only a matter of time until China achieves superiority.
Thanks for that. Moving on to one of the key tenets of air power that you touched upon is concentrated striking power against key enemy targets. That's one of the reasons why penetrating bombers are so important, because they can deliver mass in survivable fashion. There's a mix between standoff and penetration. But could you talk about a bit of the importance of stand-in strike capabilities and how these are going to be factored into the new force design?
It depends upon who you're standing in against and what you're trying to accomplish. Clearly, we need some of that kind of capability for critical targets, right? It can be accomplished in different ways. You can do it with standoff weapons up to a point, but there's cost associated with that. It's an interesting piece of history. About 30 years ago, 35 years now, I led a study for Dick Cheney called the Major Aircraft Review.
I remember that.
You remember that one?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you're old. Yeah. You're not as old as I am, but you're close. Anyway, I led that study for the aircraft that were going to be in the Navy and the Air Force for tactical warfare. My counterpart in the strategic side of the house led the B-2 study. I had the F-22, what became the F-22, and the A-12, and the other service counterparts of those. The scenario that we used on a requirements basis to convince ourselves, to convince Secretary Cheney that we should continue with the F-22 was Syria. It's right after the Cold War, and they had the most modern air defense, integrated air defense system at the time. Our pacing challenge today is not Syria. It's much tougher. So you got to take a harder look at what's the right mix and what do you want to do with it. The other thing that's true is that Syria was not a nuclear power. Russia and China are nuclear powers with a lot of nuclear weapons. So what you would do in a conventional conflict with them has to be done with an eye towards, what are the consequences in the strategic world. So these are things that we've wrestled with to some degree. My first day in office, I asked the Deputy Secretary and the Secretary of Defense, what war do you want the Air Force and Space Force to be ready to fight for you, to provide forces for? And the answer was aggression by China, followed perhaps by Russian aggression as well. We're more worried about the former than the latter. Ukraine changed our perspectives on Russia to some degree. So if that's the scenario, what's the right mix and what are the things from a policy perspective you want to really have and intend to use if the time comes? There's a deterrence piece of this too, of course. So anyway, it's a complicated question. I think as we sorted through it, China has been my emphasis. And in general, I think for the United States, our role is going to be to defeat aggression. If we can defeat aggression, we won't be in a protected conflict, conventional or nuclear. We'll have effective deterrent for that, and we'll be able to defeat operationally something like the invasion of Ukraine, if it's in a NATO country, or the invasion of Taiwan, or an assertion of sovereignty in the South China Sea, take your pick. So that would be first on my list of set of capabilities to get, followed by other things.
Let's switch gears to mobility, particularly as it relates to its importance in the Indo-Pacific theater. Obviously, our mobility force is a linchpin of future mission success. And a full-scale, large-scale operation in the Pacific would put enormous demands on our mobility forces, much more than, quite frankly, we currently possess. So how are you thinking about meeting this future challenge?
Our biggest concern, well, there are a number of concerns there. I've been part of and overseen a number of mobility studies for the DoD, and there's some truths that come out of that. You can't buy enough air mobility to move the joint force. You can move a lot of people, and you can move some high priority things, reasonable tonnage, and then that's in initial stages, and then you can sustain reasonably well after that. So there are practical limitations on what you should ask the air mobility part of the Air Force to do. I don't think we're badly sized right now for that, but we have a very aging force, and we have one that is increasingly vulnerable to attack. So we need to figure out what to do about the stressing threats. What's happening basically is that China in particular is reaching out to ever greater ranges to engage our aircraft. They're now threatening tankers at ranges that if they stayed outside those ranges, they couldn't refuel fighters within range of their targets. They're threatening transports as well as some of the aircraft we talked about earlier where we're shifting ISR in space. So we've got to address the survivability problem, the resilience problem, but we also have to recapitalize. We've got a very old fleet of tankers in particular. Some of our transports are getting LC-5s getting up there. So we have to do all of this. We've wrestled with whether we do a purpose-built design tanker and gas to address the survivability issues. That's an option that'll be on the table for the next administration. We've also looked at other things you could do to enhance the survivability of the resilience of more conventional tankers. There's some things you could do there. So that's a choice, and I think frankly, we're going to have the inventory of aircraft we have now for a long time, so we at least need to do some things to enhance the survivability of the current fleet. Same time, we're trying to recapitalize primary tankers right now. The KC-135s do have life left in them, but they have issues with reliability and cost to operate and so on. And there are features that we can put in the KC-46 that are very desirable. So how we proceed on recapitalization, as well as some of the resiliency things, is going to be driven by how people look at the priorities there and the trade-offs, but also the total amount of money available to the department. So that's that situation.
Yes, sir. Well, thanks much for that. You mentioned it earlier, but you recently made headlines when you flew in a modified F-16 that was piloted by AI. So where do you see artificial intelligence as most likely to have the largest impact on the Department of the Air Force?
There are several areas, all right. What people call artificial intelligence isn't actually artificial intelligence. It's automation in most cases. It's automation of a whole bunch of different things. Sorting out an incredibly large database of collected sensor information to pick out the targets with a form of AI, pattern recognition. Going through large, massive amounts of data to establish connections that are not obvious at all, and to do creative things to identify optimal courses of action in the battle management context, for example. And then there's, of course, the things that would be relevant in a CCA or any automated warfighting platform that you'd want to do to automate some of those functions, right? All this technology is maturing, and it's almost ubiquitous now. It's in different forms. It's coming into all sorts of products. The most recent major development is large language models that we're using to improve efficiency in a number of areas. The places I see it having the most impact are at the platform level in terms of automated behaviors that are tactical, that are under human control, certainly, but allow many of the things that would have been intuitive human judgments to be made by the machine. And the machines will do it faster, and they'll probably do it better. General Brown told me once I asked him about complex air, and you know this much better than I do, many air situation. What you have to do as a pilot, no matter how good you are, is you sort of narrow the situation down to a level you can manage, given just human limitations. The machines are going to be much better at that once they're able to process all the data. And the flight I took was for within visual range engagements, where you can see the other aircraft and you're doing tactics to try to defeat it. That software did that job reasonably well. What we're looking for in the CCAs is help for beyond visual range engagements initially, but we'll get to mixes of the others. So that's one area. But the other area I think is really important is going to be sorting out complex situations and presenting to operators for a final decision, courses of action, about how to most efficiently engage in high density, very low latency, high density in terms of numbers, but also highly compressed in terms of time, tactical situation. Yeah. That's where we're going to need the help. And the pilots I've talked to, and again, you can help me with this, seconds and fractions of seconds matter when you're doing that. And the machines are going to be really good at this.
Yeah, I'd say your last point's one that it's very hard to describe to folks that cling to the surface of the earth. That I'm not knocking folks who live on the ground because I live here too. But understanding that a split second makes an enormous difference.
It's true in the air fight, yeah. And it's also true in the space fight.
Yeah.
Though I think a space fight's going to have to be highly automated. The first mover advantage in space is significant. If you choose surprise, and what you want to do with that first mover advantage is as many things simultaneously as you can.
Yeah.
And the other side has got to react to that. That's a very tough problem. We have never had that experience before, and you're really going to need automated help to do that effectively.
As we approach the end here, and I do want to save some time for our audience members, I want to ask you about one of your signature actions, and that's putting the operational imperatives in place. I mean, that's going to stand as one of your key accomplishments. How do you evaluate where they stand today? Where do you see the most progress, and where do you see the most work still needing to be done?
I'll walk you through the list.
All right.
The first one was Space Order Battle. Very good progress there. We've got a number of things initiated under contract moving forward, largely moving to more resilient architectures, distributed communications, distributed missile warning. We're looking at sensing. We're looking at GMTI capability moving there. That's another imperative. I'll get that in a minute. But Space Order Battle is moving forward pretty well. The place where I think we should be moving faster is counter space. We need to protect the joint force from the targeting sensing that China in particular is fielding now. So we need to move faster on that, and we need more effective and efficient ways than sending a single interceptor against a single satellite. So we've done a lot of work to identify ways to address that problem, but I think we should be moving faster on that. The second is C3 battle management. I got to shout out to Luke Cropsey, General Cropsey. We're just announced we're going to give him another star, move him to be the Information Dominance Organization Commander. He's had it over 2 years right now to do the integrated PEO for C3 battle management. And the Air Force was recently given the job of being the lead service for Joint Fires Network for combatant commanders. So we're making progress there. Again, I'd like to be able to say we're moving faster. We've IOC'd some initial capabilities, but more needs to be done. It's a really tough job, but Luke has got a good job of pulling all the players together. Next is AMTI, GMTI. We're working with NRO on GMTI, and we're working on AMTI as well, also within the Space Force, but early stages for both, but good progress. Again, with more funding, we could accelerate some of that and get more capability quicker, but we're off to a good start. Air dominance, we talked about a little bit already. The NGAD family of systems. We need a final decision on NGAD, but we're very close to being ready to proceed if that program continues in its current form. The CCAs are a centerpiece of that. We're on contract for those. And I think we're pretty far down the road in defining increment 2. So that plus the other things to network these things together and the weapons to go with them, I think we're making pretty good progress on. The next thing is resilient basing, forward basing. We got a large tranche of money in the 24 budget for that. General Alvin was just in the Pacific, saw some of that money being used to increase the resilience of our bases, make agile combat employment more real. Again, we can do more with more funds, we can move faster. But we've got a good start off on that. The bomber, B-21's doing well, knock on wood. It's still in flight test. We'll see how the rest of it goes, but I feel pretty good about that. There's some other things that would be associated with the bomber to give it the family of systems approach. Those are moving forward also, and so I feel pretty good about where we are there. The last one on the 7 original ones is resilience of all the things we count on to go to war. And I think that's one where it's a national problem. It's not just a Air Force problem or Space Force or even a DoD problem. It's about the infrastructure we depend upon, the availability of electricity and water on our bases. It's about the transportation network we rely upon, as well as our own systems to manage all of our own internal functions. That's an area that I think needs a lot of additional attention at the national level, as well as within DoD. Since we started with the original 7, we've added some others. We mentioned mobility. We added that as a cross-cutting operational enabler. We added EW. We added munitions, and we added training and testing. This is a long-term race that we're in. You're not going to solve the problem and then go home. You're going to have to stay in the game, and you're going to continuously changing your emphasis depending on what the threat does and what technology makes available. So we've set up an office to manage these initiatives going forward. Integrated Capabilities Office is part of the Secretariat. Ellie Nywood has come in to run that, replaced Tim Grayson, who stayed an extra year for me and did a fantastic job. He hates it when I do this, but he was the key to getting the operational imperative moving as fast as well as they have. So we're going to continue that work. They're going to be doing it through a series of campaigns to address different operational concerns. But the institution, if you will, the Air Force and Space Force, is now taking over a lot of the operational imperative work and moving it forward. So that's sort of the big picture. But it's going to be, we will spend the rest of our careers, people younger than us are going to spend the rest of their careers working on these problems. China is an aggressive, thoughtful, well-resourced, innovative competitor, and they're not going to stop.
Awesome. One wrap-up question for you. Any words of wisdom for your successor? China, 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 one team, one fight. Very good, sir. Well, with that,
I'll go a little further if I could.
Huh?
I don't know what background the people are going to come in. You know, the Secretary of the Air Force and the Undersecretary or acquisition executives or other people. But if you have a really good background in this area, you come from the national security community, I think that, then there still will be a lot to learn when you come in to the Department of the Air Force. And I would say the most important thing, I think, is put yourself in a learning mode and be open to the very, very capable professionals who are going to have to bring you up to speed on a lot of things. If you come without a background, you're going to have to do the same thing, but it's going to be an intense fire hose. The people that work in the Pentagon and in the service in general, professional military people, professional civilians, they don't care who's in the White House. They will follow the policies of the president. They will obey lawful orders. They will implement those policies. So if it's somebody who's coming in who doesn't know this community as well, my one major piece of advice to them is listen to the people who've been doing it for all their careers and have a deep depth of knowledge and learn as much from them as quickly as you can.
Very good. Well, thanks for that, Mr. Secretary. And let's now turn our remaining time to our audience. You all know the drill by now, so when I call on you, please unmute your mic and state your name and affiliation before you ask your question. So let's kick this off with the first question to Mr. John Turpak. John, over to you.
Good morning, Mr. Secretary. Thanks for doing this. And on behalf of my colleagues, thanks for making yourself available to the press as frequently as you have over the past few years. We appreciate it. You've launched a number of initiatives. You talked a little bit about some of them, the operational imperatives, JADC2, the re-optimization. At the risk of asking you which of your children you like the best, when you talk to your successor or leave a note for them on your desk, what's the single program or initiative you feel they absolutely must continue to avoid doing serious damage to the Air Force?
I think it's less about damage than more about exploiting an opportunity. Some of the things that I've accelerated, I think, would have happened whether I was there or not. Some of the things that I've addressed, I think we're managing more effectively now than we were. The thing that I accelerated, I think, by quite a bit probably, that I think is going to be ultimately the most transformative is the CCAs. They're going to change air warfare in some very fundamental ways. And it's going to be an evolutionary thing once we get the first increment out. But I think making that first step and hopefully continuing it to the next iterations is the thing that I think will have ultimately the most lasting impact.
Okay, and if I could follow with a second one, we're in a transitional period between the munitions of arguably the 80s and 90s to the weapons of the 2030s. Give us a quick rundown on what you think the most significant ones of those are going to be, and administratively, is there anything you can do or that can be done institutionally to kind of protect the munitions? They've always been a bill payer, and we're going into any potential conflict with a magazine of maybe 10 days.
Great question. One of the things that China has done is invest in a wide array of munitions of various types, which are all designed one way or another to be superior to the things that we're fielding. We've got to respond more aggressively to that. I reviewed our munitions portfolio early on, and we created the munitions cost-cutting operational enabler as one of our major initiatives, after the operational imperatives. Weapons are getting, they tend to get more expensive. They also are getting smarter, and they're able to do things like collaborate with each other. There's a lot of innovation to be had there. But there are still some fundamentals where you want to have an advantage in, say, range for air-to-air weapons. You also want to have effective standoff at the targets that you're worried about. And to your point, John, you need the quantities that are necessary for the kinds of conflict you might find yourself in. And the lead time to build the missiles is on the order of 18 months. That's a lot. So if we do invest in the industrial base, and there's been a lot of talk about this recently, the two things that I would put at the top of my list are munitions and high demand spare parts, so that you can keep as many things in the fight as possible effectively over time. It's sort of an analogy to the ball bearing idea from World War II in a way. We can't afford to facilitate the industrial base to have a long-term conventional war suite of factories sitting idle, waiting for the war to happen. But we can do some risk management, and the area I would do it in are those two. First, munitions, and then high demand critical spare parts, so that we can have a much more effective force and win decisively in the early stages. That's really what we need to be able to do. But you have to have some risk management. You have to hedge against the possibility that the conflict will go on longer and that you're going to need to have a more protracted fight. And I think that's the right way to approach that. To me, it's a risk management problem.
Okay,
Thank you, sir.
Let's switch to Brian Everstein. Brian?
Vein, I was hoping you could kind of look more broadly about yours and the Air Force's impact on industry responsiveness to the DoD. There's been some good news with some of the OI work, increased presence of non-traditional such as CCA, but also there's plenty of less happy news such as your public negotiations on Wedgetail earlier this year and some major program delays. What is your assessment of how the Air Force industry relationship has evolved, and what changes would you want to see going forward?
I think some of those changes are underway because of competitive pressure. I mean, the most effective way to influence industry is through the profit motive. And competition is the best way to put that on the table. When we did the competition for CCAs, we had some of the traditional, defense contractors, large defense contractors, as well as the two winners. And I think, and I've watched what in the space arena a number of companies are doing to be more efficient and more effective there for commercial reasons largely. And Frank Calvelli's done a really good job as my acquisition executive for space, as has Dork Tenure at Space Development Agency, to bring some of those technologies and those competitors in. So introducing competition from more innovative and more agile companies, I think, is a big wake-up call for the major primes, and they're going to need to respond to that. And I see some evidence that they're doing that. One of the things that I think happened, and this is a bigger picture thing, and it's more to my AT&L background than this one, but the consolidation that happened after the Cold War and getting to a much smaller number of companies eliminated a lot of competition. But the thing that allowed that competition was the numbers of things we were doing and the fact that the volume for them was enough in some cases. Munitions is a good example, to have competition among the primes. Raytheon and Hughes used to compete with each other for a number of missile systems, where we had two companies producing the same missile. We don't do that anymore. And what happened over the period of 30 years or so after the Cold War was first the consolidation, and then very infrequent refreshes of technology or recapitalization. For example, 30 years between the F-22 and NGAD. That F-35 is a single program won by one company who didn't really see much in the way of competition for quite a long period of time. You don't get lean and mean in that kind of an environment. When I was in industry with one of the major primes, which was very much in a competitive environment, we acquired another company that did sole source work for the intelligence community. The cultural differences between those two companies were profound. The one I was with was extremely cost conscious, working very hard to have competitive products and keep costs under control. The other one was very relaxed, and people weren't working nearly as hard. There just was a very different culture there. So having competition and finding ways to create it and bringing outsiders in, I think, is one way to do that. But the other way to do it is through what you buy and how you buy it. So I think right now, with the threats that we're facing, we have got to refresh, we've got to modernize and improve our capability on much tighter timelines. We should be doing a more wide variety of things. All of that will motivate industry. And I think if you do those things, then you're going to have an industry that responds to that and becomes much more capable. For the first time in my experience, I think we're starting to bring in outside new startups, if you will, or non-traditional suppliers in a way which I think is a big wake-up call for our traditional primes. They're going to have to change, but it's going to be the profit motive that makes them do that.
Very good. Let's go to Frank Wolf, please. Frank?
Yeah. Hi, Mr. Secretary. Just wanted to follow up on, as you know, Elon Musk's comments and on the F-35. And playing devil's advocate here, what you've already sort of indicated CCA has been your a priority and sort of something to likely keep. What would be wrong, playing devil's advocate, in sort of halting the F-35 buy? In other words, we continue F-35 in terms of the numbers we have right now, and possibly manned NGAD, and then rapidly accelerating development of CCA and other unmanned programs such as Replicator, for example. What do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, I'll give you my views. The F-35 isn't going away. It's a state-of-the-art system that's continuously being upgraded. There's a reason so many countries are buying the F-35. It is dominant over fourth-generation aircraft, period, in a very, very serious way. It's not even close. And there is no alternative to that in the near term. It's gonna, if we do continue with NGAD, it's going to be several years before we start to fill them in quantity, and it's going to be a very expensive airplane compared to F-35. So I don't see F-35 being replaced. I think we're going to continue to buy it. We should continue to buy it. We also should continue to upgrade it. We need better performance out of Lockheed, quite honestly. They're not delivering what they've been promising, and they're not doing it as fast as they could by a wide margin. But we did drive the cost down over the first 15 or so years. I spent a lot of time on that when I was in AT&L. And we just announced we've reached agreement on lots 18 and 19. Now, for a variety of factors, we're not driving costs down as much as we were, but I think more effort needs to be put into that. But it's such a world-class platform compared to the alternatives that I don't see it going anywhere. There's a pretty big number is our inventory objective for F-35. It's 1,700 and some. I don't know what we'll end up buying, and nobody can predict that right now. I know we're going to buy more, and we're going to be buying more for some period of time. At some point, this will be dependent in some part on what we do with NGAD and what we do with ACCAs. We'll probably revisit that. I don't think we're ready to do that yet. I think right now we need to add them to the inventory at whatever's the most affordable rate, given the mix of things we're doing, that we can acquire.
Yeah, Mr. Secretary, if I may, and Frank, I would just remind you that we just saw U.S.-produced F-35s employed by Israel penetrate into the heart of Iran and not just avoid the Russian most advanced surface-to-air missile systems, but destroy them and return safely with no losses. There are no drones out there today that can do that, so it's something to think about. Mr. Secretary, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our Aerospace Nation series. On behalf of the Mitchell Institute and the Air and Space Forces Association, we wish you all the best in your next endeavors, and I hope you have a wonderful holiday season, and thanks for all you've done for our Air Force and Space Force. So with that, we wish you a very successful and a happy air and space power kind of day.
Thanks, Dave. Always great working with you.
You bet.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.